So this lesson is going to address chapter 8 in Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Dreams are a theme that Fitzgerald spends a lot of time discussing and exploring in this chapter. The plot picks up really just a few hours after Nick has left the Buchanans, and he's tossing and turning in his own house, as he says, half sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. And really, who can blame him? The experiences of the previous 12 hours were pretty haunting, and what a nightmare. Nick continues. He says, "Toward dawn, I heard a taxi go up Gatsby's drive, and immediately I jumped out of bed and began to dress. I felt that I had something to tell him, something to warn him about, and morning would be too late." So time is really everything now in this chapter, and Fitzgerald, through Nick, is conjuring a sense of urgency. A timeline is established. That's what's important about Gatsby saying, "I stayed until 4 o'clock before he leaves his vigil over Daisy's house." And I want you to notice the adjectives that Fitzgerald uses. There's a major shift in tone. He's starting to use adjectives such as ghostly, dust, musty, and stale. And so even though Gatsby is holding on to the hope that he has for he and Daisy getting together, there's certainly an inevitable end that is being addressed. Nick understands that, and certainly we as readers understand that this is naive and he needs to give this up. So it's this end, this giving up of this fantasy, that makes sense for Fitzgerald to then introduce how it is that Nick found out about the origins of J. Gatsby. You know, what is the truth? Because the facade of J. Gatsby is crumbling at this point as well, in addition to the dream that he had about being with Daisy. And it is through this recollection that readers finally get a unique insight through then Gatsby's perspective about what it is that's so enchanting about Daisy. And again, pay attention to the adjectives that are being used. You've got a lot of things that have to do with a dreamlike quality, and then also the references to the word cool. And even though it's not being used to describe a season in this particular context, it does contrast with the previous chapter's use of hot. Hot equates to agitation and eventually conflict. Cool is very even, and there's a temperament that exists that's very positive. So this is about Daisy. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities, he had come in contact with such people, but always with an indiscernible barbed wire between. He found her excitingly desirable. He went to her house, at first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him. He had never been in such a beautiful house before. And that's important for you to think about. Is he in love with Daisy, or is he in love with Daisy's home and what her house represents? But what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there. It was as casual a thing to her as his tent out at camp was to him. There was a ripe mystery about it, a hint of bedrooms upstairs more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms, of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romances that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, but fresh and breathing and redolent of this year's shining motor cars, and of dances whose flowers were scarcely withered. It excited him, too, that many men had already loved Daisy. It increased her value in his eyes. He felt their presence all about the house, pervading the air with the shades and echoes of still vibrant emotions. So there we are with more ghosts from the past sort of popping up. And now Fitzgerald is able to move effortlessly back to the notion of dreams and the risks that were involved in the masquerade, essentially, that Gatsby has entangled himself in. But he knew that he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. However precious might be his future as J. Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past, and at any moment the invisible cloak of his uniform might slip from his shoulders. So he made the most of his time. He took what he could get, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually, he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. And yes, that is a euphemism for them sleeping together. He might have despised himself, for he had certainly taken her under false pretenses. I don't mean that he had traded on his phantom millions, but he had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security. He let her believe that he was a person from much the same strata as herself, that he was fully able to take care of her. As a matter of fact, he had no such facilities. He had no comfortable family standing behind him, and he was liable at the whim of an impersonal government to be blown anywhere about the world. But he didn't despise himself, and it didn't turn out as he had imagined. He had intended, probably, to take what he could and go. But now he found that he had committed himself to the following of a grail. He knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. She vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. He felt married to her, that was all. When they met again 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him, and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. And that, I think, is the poetry of Fitzgerald. There's so much going on there, the differentiation between class, the notion of reality and fantasy and dreams, and what people know and understand to be true and what they wish to be true. So it's the next paragraph that, that has the line that I think encapsulates the theme of what Fitzgerald has really been exploring throughout the whole novel, especially with the characters who are a bit more unsavory. And that is where he talks about of his relationship with Daisy, that he wishes that she would throw him over, and that she didn't because, as he says, she was in love with me too. And then a few lines later he says, and all of a sudden, I didn't care. Well, that's the key to responsibility and ownership of one's actions, to care. And if you watch the John Green crash course videos over The Great Gatsby, one of them discusses this notion of caring, and he will talk about it a little bit more, but now seems a good time to bring up a point that he makes. Look at Nick's last name. Fitzgerald has designated him with the name Care Away. Next, we move on to a clarified timeline of Daisy and Gatsby's relationship. It is true, they only dated for 1 month, which is better than Romeo and Juliet, who dated for 24 hours. But they did stay in contact while Gatsby was involved in the war. And yet, though, this chapter discusses the obligations that she's under socially and so forth. And I think it's difficult for 21st century readers to really understand how real those would have been for someone in her position in the teens. It is her reality that finding an appropriate man to marry is part of her responsibility, and Fitzgerald weaves in that notion of time and a sense of urgency that has driven so many characters into her choices as well. Through this twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly she was again keeping 6 dates a day with 6 men, and drowsing asleep at dawn with the beads and chiffon of an evening dress tangled among dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. And all the time, something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately. And the decision must be made by some force of love, of money, of unquestionable practicality that was close at hand. That force took shape in the middle of spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome bulkiness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless, there was a certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. And of course, we can guess that this is the letter that she was holding in her hand. His response to this letter, that she was getting married, is what was balled up in her hands the night before her wedding, which was recounted by Jordan in chapter 4. So that tells us a little bit about how all of the timelines work together, and then we get a bit more of the story from Gatsby's viewpoint from the time in 1918 when he returned to America. And it doesn't matter how close he was to Daisy and to the memories that existed between the two of them, he was too late. She was already gone. He came back from France when Tom and Daisy were still on their wedding trip, and he made a miserable but irresistible journey to Louisville on the last of his army pay. He stayed there a week, walking the streets where their footsteps had clicked together through the November night and revisiting the out-of-the-way places to which they had driven in her white car. Just as Daisy's house had always seemed to him more mysterious and gay than other houses, so his idea of the city of itself, even though she was gone from it, was pervaded with a melancholy beauty. He left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her, that he was leaving her behind. The day coach, he was penniless now, was hot. He went out to the open vestibule and sat down on a folding chair, and the station slid away and the backs of unfamiliar buildings moved by. Then out into the spring fields where a yellow trolley raced them for a minute with people in it who might once have seen the pale magic of her face along the casual street. The track curved, and now it was going away from the sun, which, as it sank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she had drawn her breath. He stretched out his hand desperately as if to snatch only a wisp of air, to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. But it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best, forever. And this is really important in terms of the orientation of Gatsby on the train. The train is moving forward, but because he's in the back looking out, he is looking in the opposite direction of where the future is headed. Fitzgerald really captures the sense of loss, and we can understand Gatsby's grief. I can look at him objectively as a reader and understand how naive his actions are, but there is something universal about wanting something that you just can't have. We also see a parallel between this flashback and the scene in chapter 1 where Nick sees Gatsby standing on the shore, reaching his hand out toward the green light, which is, of course, Daisy's dock. So a timeline, again, though, is established where we see that as these conversations are taking place, it's now 9 o'clock in the morning, there's a finishing of breakfast, and Nick gets ready to leave for work. Nick gets ready to leave, but of course he stalls several times, and he says, "I'm gonna call you at noon," once he gets to work. Nick then comments to Gatsby one statement that becomes a foreshadowing of the end, and there are really two things going on. Number one, he gives him a compliment, and that compliment is also juxtaposed with a line where he says, "Though I disapproved of him from beginning to end." And I don't know if I believe that. I want you to think about that as well, if that's a true statement, because it seems like he's been pretty impressed with Gatsby the entire time. But the second thing is that he says goodbye. Now, you know there's a change in the air, since once he gets to work, he talks about a conversation that he has with Jordan, and where her voice was used to be fresh and cool, it's changed to become harsh and dry. And once his conversation is over with Jordan, because someone has hung up on the other person, he calls Gatsby. Now, this is a reflection really of his character. He has said he would, and he does. But the line is busy because in those early days of phone calls, an operator would manually be keeping the line open. So Gatsby is expecting an important phone call, and he doesn't want anything else, any other calls coming in that would block that. So he tries multiple times during that noon timeline to call, and then decides he's going to take the 3:50 train home, which would put him home a little bit after 4 o'clock. Nick then gives readers insight into what happened with George and Myrtle Wilson, a scene that he was not present for, but he can do that because, remember, all of this plot is really just one big flashback to 1922. So he can give us information that he has garnered in the meantime and give it to us roughly in chronological order. So on the night that Myrtle was killed, her husband George is struggling with the reality of the situation, which who wouldn't? At 3 a.m., so this is the same time that Gatsby is keeping vigil over Daisy's house, this is the same time that Nick is having these restless dreams, George tells his neighbor Michaelis that he has a way of finding out who owns the yellow car. And we know that he's gonna be able to do that because he knows who was driving it earlier in the afternoon. He's gonna access Tom. And this scene is also crucial because this is where George connects that the person driving the car must be the person responsible for breaking Myrtle's nose earlier in the summer. His connection is founded on some pretty, I think, legitimate logic, where he knows that his wife has a lover. Her lover is violent and abusive. She probably knew the person that she was running out to the yellow car to, and that he hit her. So he thinks that if he can discover who was driving the car, he will answer two questions that are in his mind. Who was her lover and who was her killer, who he thinks are one and the same person. The parallel timeline between the scene of George's experiences and those of Gatsby's is reinforced with the line, about 5 o'clock, it was blue enough outside to snap off the light. So that's the scene that's happening between him and Michaelis, and then that's also parallel to the conversation that was happening between Nick and Gatsby in his own home. Then we have the theme of observation and judgment that comes back as George references the eyes of the Dr. T.J. Eckelberg advertisement, though he has confused them with the eyes of God, where he makes the comment that these eyes know, the eyes of God know the secret crimes of everyone. The parallel timeline continues because then we know at noon, when Nick was attempting to call Gatsby, that George had already walked from the Valley of Ashes to Gad's Hill. Although he disappears from noon, from the perspective of any investigator, they don't know what it is that he's doing for those 3 hours because as they know he's looking for the person who owns the yellow car, no car repair shops report him coming in. But we as astute readers know that he doesn't have to consult any car repair shops. He's going straight to Tom. Fitzgerald then gives us a timeline for Gatsby, which is crucial to the plot because the 3 timelines are going to converge with George, Gatsby, and Nick. It's at 2 p.m. that Gatsby heads to his own pool, and note the change in the seasons here. Gatsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. Once he stopped and shifted it a little, and the chauffeur asked him if he needed help, but he shook his head in a moment disappeared among the yellowing trees. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without a sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe that it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like the ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. The chauffeur, he was one of Wolfsheim's protégés, heard the shots. Afterward, he could only say that he hadn't thought anything much about them. I drove from the station directly to Gatsby's house, and my rushing anxiously up the front steps was the first thing that alarmed anyone. But they knew then, I firmly believe. With scarcely a word said, 4 of us, the chauffeur, butler, gardener, and I, hurried down to the pool. There was a faint, barely perceptible movement of water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other. With little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves, the laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course, with its accidental burden. The touch of a cluster of leaves revolved it slowly, tracing, like the leg of a compass, a thin, red circle in the water. It was after we started with Gatsby toward the house that the gardeners saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. So a few things that I want to talk about here. First of all, Holocaust is not referencing anything from World War II. Of course, remember, this is published in 1925. So that does tell us for certain that Wilson is dead and that Gatsby is dead. Sometimes students get confused because they're moving his body, but they don't mean they're walking with him. They're literally transporting his body up. So Gatsby and George are both gone. It was a murder-suicide. And also the fact that Nick has given some thought to what it is that's going on in Gatsby's mind. And that takes somebody who's pretty empathetic as well. That tells us quite a bit that he can think beyond himself and ponder what must have been. And I think that is a positive quality. Even though Nick is not without flaw, that speaks to him being able to empathize with someone, even if he doesn't approve of him, Gatsby that is. So the summer has closed, and it has also taken the lives of 3 characters, Myrtle, George, and Gatsby. And that's a lot of destruction for such a slim novel. But it does speak to Fitzgerald's skill as a writer to weave these storylines together. So tune in for the lesson over the final chapter to see how Fitzgerald concludes what I believe is a masterpiece.